Picture this, an evening on the river in mid-May, when the sun has slipped behind high sandstone ridges. Spring has given birth to a new earth. The trees, recently barren, are now carpeted with young leaves. The air is soft and sweet with the pungent fragrance of bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, lichens, lady ferns, and the river itself. Throughout the spring, the vernal sun has risen higher and higher into the sky, spilling sunlight into the riffles and runs, adding energy and vitality. Millions of mayfly nymphs have waxed fat and are prepared for a grand transformation. Some have migrated to the downstream side of boulders in the fast riffles and pockets. Others have crawled or swum into the calmer stream edges, eddies, and backwaters. 2 days ago, they emerged from the water, shed their skins, and transformed into duns and struggled to escape the surface of their watery realm. The lucky ones took to the air and made it to the trees. In a day or two, the mayflies have transformed once more, this time into finely crafted, sleek, and shiny flying machines. Now, at the holy hour, as darkness closes in, they leave the safety of the trees, fly back to the river, and begin their urgent dance. The smaller males, with their big compound eyes, take positions high above the river, facing upstream, occasionally darting sharply, always parallel to the stream, before returning to that spot. Soon, female mayflies laden with eggs begin to leave the trees and race through the armada of male spinners. As darkness closes in, the spinners descend to eye level, hover above the river, find a partner, and mate. When each couple's last dance is over, they fall dramatically onto the water. Their egg mass is released, sinks to the bottom, setting the stage for the next generation of mayfly nymphs who will be born and live in the river. Soon, the river becomes carpeted with spent spinners, whose last act has been to return their bodies to the river, thus enriching the same water in which their offspring will live. The wildlife along the river, so tuned into their environment, are well aware and are taking advantage of an easy buffet. Trout, bass, fallfish, and chubs are rising leisurely to the spent mass. While the light remains, the day birds swoop in for their share. And as darkness approaches, bats and the occasional nighthawk or whippoorwill take their places, catching spinners inches above the water. Families of geese and ducks swirl around, gobbling up the spent spinners. Toads are working the edges of the river. What a magnificent scene. Perfect balance. All these creatures so well tuned to their environment. Then there's this guy, the hapless human, struggling to untangle his line, his ears getting drilled by black flies, his boots leaking, his eyes failing. He is running out of time. He has tried 5 times to attach the wrong fly to the end of a tangled leader. And he's been watching that other guy upstream land fish after fish. It's all like a bad dream. Looks like he needs a little help, doesn't he? Hello, Andy here. Happy spring and welcome to my channel. I'm sure most of us have felt like that guy mentioned in the introduction, at least once in our lives. I was that guy once. I still am on occasion, especially way back when I was in my teens and early 20s. Back then, we didn't have online resources and YouTube creators to find information about situations like this. As a kid, I had a few good books, my dad, and the occasional old-timer I met on the stream to help me out. Otherwise, it was a matter of time on the stream, observing and gaining experience. I would still recommend getting on-stream experience over listening to someone like me drone on. But I've had enough experience on the stream to have something to say about fly fishing during a spinner fall, especially for those new to fly fishing. And I have to say that fly fishing during a spinner fall is my favorite time on the river. And with a little luck and some basic knowledge, it can be some of the easiest fly fishing you'll experience. Yes, I said easy. However, even during a fine spinner fall, having success is not a given. I'd like to tell you about some of those times and some of the tactics you can use to increase your chances of success. Let's start with the insects themselves. As you know, all mayfly species need to return to the stream to mate and lay eggs, thus ensuring the species' survival. Having spent most of their life in the water, their terrestrial life is brief and urgent and fraught with danger. Those that survive to the spinner stage, or imago, come back to the river to perform mating flights, dancing above the stream, find a mate, lay eggs, and fall back to the water. This is when the mayflies are gobbled up by the trout. And how and when this occurs depends on the species, on the time of the hatch, air temperatures, time of day, weather conditions, and other factors. For example, while a particular hatch may last 2 or 3 weeks, significant numbers of spinners may not appear right away, nor every evening. Conditions may be too cool or too rainy for the spinners to decide to initiate mating flights. When the air temperature is cool, especially near the beginning of spring hatches, spinners may opt to fly earlier in the day, say the afternoon. As a general rule, when air temperatures are warmer, some species will wait until late evening to fly. Rain, high winds can hold them down, but there are those times when all things come together, and the result is an intense and spectacular spinner fall. I've said there's dozens of species of mayfly with significant hatches. I'll mention just a few as the best examples of what I'm trying to get across. Hendricksons, March browns, sulfurs, green drakes, and slate drakes are a few of the premier hatches that can produce fantastic spinner falls. Each one of these are different in their own way, so learning about each of these are important. The example I gave in the introduction was the American March brown, or the Great Red Spinner, as they call it locally here in Pennsylvania, which produced one of the longest lasting, dependable, and magnificent spinner falls, and which are stretched out over a period of weeks. These are big, meaty flies that trout really go for. Their flights may occur across the entire river, but will be concentrated over the riffles in fast water. Although generally dependable, sometimes the male spinners appear over the water, but their flights are aborted, and they may retreat back to the trees to wait another day. Early during the hatch, and when the weather is cool and overcast, the spinners may appear in the late afternoon, and as the season wears on and temperatures rise, they will appear closer to dusk. Sulfurs, in contrast, may congregate more densely over the riffles and may form great spherical clouds of swirling spinners that may move lower and closer to the surface of the river. Sulfurs are more prone to fall in great numbers, suddenly covering the surface, literally carpeting the stream from bank to bank, especially where a long, fast riffle spills into a large pool. This can make it very hard for a fly fisherman to get the trout to notice his particular imitation among the millions of spent spinners on the surface. Hendricksons, one of our early to mid-spring hatches, it's common to see spinners appear in the late afternoon while the sun is still shining. In the case of green drakes, their spinners, the coffin fly, are something entirely different. Forget seeing them in the afternoon. Many times these huge spinners fall when it is quite dark, and the enormous amount of biomass available can make it very hard for a trout to find your imitation. I could go on forever about the differences between the various species, but I encourage you to research that for yourselves. Now let's talk a little bit about trout behavior during some of these major spinner falls. First, spinner falls occur on many nights over the course of a hatch. Trout tend to anticipate the spinners appearing and are accustomed to their arrival. They are ready for it, and they will often favor the spinners over other flies on the water. As the flights of spinners take place in the air above them, trout are watching them, even as they might be sipping duns or chasing emergers on the surface. When the time comes, trout can suddenly shift their behavior and feeding style to concentrate on the spinners. For example, March brown spinners may start to hit the water during their mating flights, only to fly up into the air once more. Trout may shift to aggressive, splashy rises as they try to intercept these actively moving spinners. This is especially more common in the heavy riffles and pocket water, where trout have been watching the flies and due to the fast water need to make aggressive rises to capture their first spinners of the evening. Then when the spinners start laying on the water, the trout may suddenly shift their feeding mode to quiet but frequent sipping, often resulting in subtle rise forms. In slower sections of the river, such as a long pool, trout may shift into the cruising mode when trout never maintain a stationary position, instead moving around, taking in as many spent spinners as possible. These trout may follow the spent mass from the top of the pool, moving downstream, taking flies, and eventually turning around at the base of the pool only to head back to the top of the pool to repeat the process. I'm going to go back to my journals for an entry from June 4th, 1982, when I was fishing Penns Creek at the Broadwaters pool, when I witnessed an incredible example of cruising trout. As darkness approached, sulfur duns and spinners were on the water, and the trout began to feed. I moved out into the center of the stream and changed to a number 12 sulfur. I missed several good rises. Soon, trout began feeding heavily on the sulfur spinners. I soon realized that the trout were moving downstream as they fed at an alarming rate. It was like fishing at a highway or a conveyor belt. They just kept coming and coming. Every rise was 1 foot or 1 yard downstream from the last one. Darkness and a wet fly hampered my fishing. I finally caught 2 10 to 11 inch native browns. I missed at least 10 fish. They just kept coming. At least 100 fish must have passed me and gone downstream. One I saw was huge. Darn interesting fishing. I love it. I figured the downstream migration is a way of conserving energy and getting a lot more food at the same time. I just wonder what they all do when they get to the bottom of the Broadwaters. Their feeding style was quiet and casual. This entry into my journal, talking about an amazing spinner fall and trout behavior, occurred over 40 years ago, and I was 21 going on 22 that year. But that night really struck me because of the unusual trout behavior that I hadn't seen before, and the amount of spinners on the water, and the fact that I only was able to land a couple of fish, with 100 fish passing me. And I was bound and determined to learn more about spinner falls and trout behavior going forward. It's just as likely to find trout concentrated at the head of the pool and the riffle above during a hatch, because this is where most of the duns have been emerging and where the spinners tend to concentrate before hitting the water. Finally, and this is where things get really interesting, as darkness approaches and takes over, if spinners are on the water, trout may suddenly appear seemingly out of nowhere, sometimes within a rod's length of you, sometimes directly behind you, literally feeding in your wake. And as darkness becomes fast and the trout become obsessed with feeding, they may become unaware of your presence, just gobbling up flies with abandon. Sometimes a 3-foot cast is all you need. And don't be surprised if the next day you return to the river to repeat the glorious experience and find there are flies everywhere, but the trout are not feeding at all. This happens all the time. My theory is that when trout get this pigged out, they take a break just to digest. And that's when the old phrase, "You should have been here yesterday," rings so true. We've considered the behavior of the bugs and the trout. Now let's talk about tactics. Many of my listeners already know what I'm about to say. I'm sure I could learn a thing or two from you, so if you have an opinion or want to share an experience or insight, please feel free to use the comments section. But for those who are young or new to fly fishing, I'll offer a few spinner tactics I've used over the more than half a century that I've been fly fishing for trout. Prepare ahead of time. As with anything, your chances of success will greatly increase if you prepare ahead of time. Spend time on the river and learn as much as you can. If you want to learn more about the life cycle and behavior of each major mayfly hatch, I suggest you look for good online resources. But don't forget there are great reference books available by some of the greatest fly fishing experts. When I was in my mid-20s, it might have been 1985, I found a great book called Hatches by Al Cauchy and Bob Nastasi, published around 1975. They put a tremendous amount of time and effort to compile a wealth of information, including the life cycle of each species, how they behave, where they live, where best to look for them, how trout respond, and finally what flies to use. I highly recommend this book. Another resource I leaned on was Charlie Meck's Meeting and Fishing the Hatches, published around 1977. There are many other great references as well. It's a good idea to keep a good selection of spinners on hand in various sizes and colors to imitate the spinners for blueing olives, blue quills, black quills, Hendricksons, March browns, sulfurs, Cahills, slate drakes, and green drakes, among others. I like the polywing spinners because they're durable, easy to tie, and they work very well. Above all, I recommend spending time on the river. Observe everything. The flies, the trout, the wildlife, the weather, everything. And see for yourself how these aspects of the natural world influenced each other. Take notes on paper or on your phone and keep a journal of your experiences on the river to refer to later. When one thinks of a spinner fall, a nice slow pool with quietly rising trout may come to mind. I love fishing in the pools. However, you may increase your chances by trying water you have overlooked, especially when the pools are crowded with other fishermen. I'll give you an example by telling you a story. Many years ago, when I was still in my teens, I was fly fishing on Penns Creek when, walking along the banks, I stumbled upon an aluminum fly box. Upon opening it, I found a set of hand-tied spent wing dry flies, size 10. I recognized these to be tied to imitate the great red spinners the local old-timers talked about. I was familiar with these spinners from my years as a youth fly fishing with my dad. I put that box on my vest and walked on. A few years later, I arrived at Penns Creek to fish the evening rise. I was late as usual, and the section I wanted to fish, one of the best pools on the river, was occupied by way too many other guys. So I took a spot on the steep bank above the incoming riffle where some big boulders created a section of very fine pocket water and deep runs. I noticed the great red spinners were descending onto the water. Big browns responded and started making violent rises. I took out that aluminum fly box, put on one of the spent wing spinner imitations, and proceeded to target fish. In the course of an hour, I hooked and released a dozen strong wild brown trout. The crowd in the pool below was having some nice quiet time, but not catching too many trout. I thanked the heavens and the guy who lost that fly box and left the stream with a new understanding. I still keep that box in my vest pocket for good luck. From that time on, I frequently fished spinners in the heavy pocket water, especially along shady sections where the spinners came down to the water early, and I would still have time to move back to the pool at dark to catch the spinners cruising the pool. So what did I learn? First, many times the greatest spinner activity is above fast water. They are attracted to the sound of the rushing water. Second, trout in fast sections have seen this before and are looking for the spinners. Third, if the section is shaded early in the evening, the activity will start early and you still may have time to move back to the nice pool before the evening closes. And finally, these fish have to make fast decisions and may be less selective and impulsive. An added bonus, these fish, which I call pocket monsters, are the strongest fish in the river, and they know how to use the currents to their advantage during a fight. All that I've said about fishing spinners in fast water, there's no problem with finding a nice pool and waiting for the action to come to you, especially if there's a big productive riffle upstream. Positioning at the head of the pool where the riffle spills in, or at the tail of the pool above a big riffle, are good tactics as well. Let's talk about overlapping hatches. It's common to have multiple hatches happening at the same time during a spinner fall. For example, an emergence of sulfur duns. So I recommend using a tandem arrangement when fishing these conditions. And when I say tandem, I mean fishing two flies at once to match different species on the water. And in these arrangements, when fishing a spinner fall, I typically separate the flies by approximately 18 inches of monofilament. This will increase your chances of hooking trout. I have a few favorite combinations. They include March brown spinner and a sulfur spinner at once, March brown spinner or sulfur dun or emerger, March brown spinner or a deer hair caddis, a spinner, any kind, and a soft tackle fly, a sulfur spinner and a sulfur dun or emerger, and of course, there's lots of other combinations that might play as well. Here's another thing to consider. I will often change to a spinner before the spinners are even on the water. Most fly fishers wait until they see spinners on the water and then make the change. So why do I do this? The reason is the trout have seen each evening, every day, for perhaps a week, spinners over the water, and they are ready for them. Second, it seems to me that the trout favor the spinners for some reason. Once they see one, they just might switch preferences from a dun to a spinner. If you make that change earlier, put on a spinner, you might land a few more trout. We talked about cruisers earlier in this video. When dealing with cruisers, working on a spent mass of spinners, try to anticipate where the trout is likely to rise, again based on the behavior of that trout. For example, 5 feet down and 3 feet left. Then, like Wayne Gretzky, anticipating the next position of the puck, place the fly where the trout is likely to be. It's a challenging game to play, but one you can win on occasion. Another tactic, stay late. If you want to catch more trout during a spinner fall, stay later than anyone else on the river. Lots of action happens just before and after dusk. As darkness closes in, you may find trout appearing seemingly out of nowhere and within easy casting reach. Trout can be completely unaware of your presence, sometimes rising literally 3 feet away or in your own wake. So in fishing late into the evening and into the dark, eventually your vision is going to fail. So when your vision fails, you can start using your ears, your intuition, and a keen sense of timing to hook the trout. Sometimes when I can barely see, my catch rate actually goes up and I can't understand why. Maybe I'm using the force, I'm not sure. What might be happening is I'm not overcompensating, so that when I go to strike, I'm giving myself a little bit more time before actually committing, and that might be increasing my catch rates. I really don't know. And here's a final tactic that I use. When the surface of the stream becomes so covered with spent spinners, try casting in a rapid fire style. Put that fly in front of that trout as quickly and as often as possible. Eventually the fish is going to take it. And finally, savor the time on the river, because very soon it'll all be over. Well, thanks for watching this video. I appreciate your time, and I hope you found something in here that is of value to you. I wish you all a great spring fly fishing season. Good luck and have fun out there. One late afternoon in mid-May, my buddy and I hiked several miles downstream to find an unoccupied stretch of open water on Penn's Creek. We settled on a place where the river transforms from a series of gentle flats into a cascade of energetic riffles, runs, and pocket water. Between these disparate sections was a riffle and pool perfect in size for two fly fishers. At 4:30 p.m., while the sun was still high in the sky, we began fishing this promising water, with the hope as rich as the limestone flow before us. Surely, if we worked hard and applied our experience, we would soon be taking the trout that were positioned at the head of the pool in anticipation of a heavy dun emergence or spinnerfall. After an hour, after perhaps hundreds of casts, and after half a dozen change-ups, we only had a few half-hearted strikes between us. "Fished out," I exclaimed. "Should have been here yesterday," my buddy shot back. But these bogus excuses did not change the feeling that we were being set up for a good old-fashioned skunking. This was Penn's Creek after all. Despite having secured a perfect section for an evening rise, my restlessness and boredom began to overcome my sensibilities. So I drifted on downstream to scout out the heavy pocket water below. I would work my way back up in time for the evening rise. My buddy would hold fort at the top of the pool and try to conjure up a trout out of the heavy flow using nymphs and emergers. By 8:15 p.m., I had traveled back upriver to join my buddy in the riffle at the head of the pool. There, March brown spinners, sulfur spinners, and sulfur duns were gathering over the stream or emerging out of the riffle. Several trout were rising, and my buddy was hooked into a nice wild brown trout. I started to fish a March brown spinner and a sulfur emerger tandem and quickly hooked and released a nice brown on the sulfur emerger. Soon, a fly fishing guide and his cadre of 6 customers arrived in the pool below. They were milling around, waiting for something to happen, occasionally gazing upstream at the action that was occurring up in the riffle. My buddy and I had found a sweet spot on this section of the river. A few trout later, I looked downstream again. The guided party was gone, perhaps on a long walk back to their lodge for a stiff drink. The river belonged to us once again, or perhaps, maybe I should say, we belonged to the river, because deep into this roadless area between the steep sandstone ridges, nighttime comes in fast. The western glow, if there was any at all, was hidden by the dark shadow of the mountain to the west. Behind the mountain to the east, darkness was racing in at 800 miles per hour. It took us by surprise. We should have seen it coming. We had plenty of warning. We must have missed the moment when the first daybirds had become silent and when the first bat had appeared overhead. We were too preoccupied to notice that a deep gloom was swallowing up the remains of a once bright mid-May day. This was because the riffle in front of us, so quiet and seemingly barren for hours before, had come alive. Big March brown and sulfur spinners were hitting the water. Amid a flurry of sulfur duns, the surface became carpeted with struggling mayflies. I checked my March brown spinner and sulfur emerger tandem, squinted into the gloom, and continued to cast. Suddenly, and seemingly out of nowhere, a pod of 8 to 10 sizable trout appeared directly in front of us, only a rod or 2 lengths away, and just out of the main current between us and the far bank. I could see the vague images of big heads poking through the water, wide white maws opening and closing, slurping in the darkness. I continued to cast and timed each drift. 1,000, 2 1,000, strike. 1,000, 2 1,000, strike. Casting in a rapid-fire fashion, listening for the slurp, not seeing much of anything, knowing that they were there 2 rod lengths away right in front of me. A silent shadow passes over our heads. I wheel around and see the dark form against the last glow of the twilight. A whippoorwill, one of the god birds, coursing over the river, tipping his wings to the fools on the water. I turn back to the darkness. The heads are bobbing. One more cast, and then I will quit. Just one more cast. I think about the bears in the mountains, that they are real, that eventually we will cross paths, the bear and I. Probably on a night like this, in close quarters, along a winding path in a rhododendron thicket. I tell my friend that it is good to have company when fly fishing like this at night. My buddy remarks that the bear can catch only one of us. I say that I can run faster than him. I gaze back into the gloom, but I'm relying mostly on my ears. Just one more cast. My line crosses and gets tangled. I work on the line as my headlamp starts failing and a mosquito drills into my neck. Just one more cast. I think I see a big head rise just below where my spinner ought to be. 1,000, 2 1,000. I lift my rod tip. I feel a solid weight followed by a deep throbbing pull. The line goes left, screaming downstream. The big trout makes a run for the deep pool below. I hold on tight and follow, stumbling downstream in the darkness. My shin hits a boulder and I fall face first into the water. My right hand jams hard into a rock. The reel clunks and I nearly lose my grip on the rod. I lift my head out of the water just in time to hear the reel screaming again. Zing, snap, damn. He's gone. I scrape myself off the stream bottom, limp back to where my buddy is standing. He is laser focused on the big heads and the slurping casting away like a madman into the darkness. Warm blood is flowing from my knuckles, running down my elbow and dripping into the water. The mosquito is back. As I turn back towards the river, my buddy says, "Andy." "What?" I say. "There's something wrong with us."